March 1945, Western Germany. The war is still audible in the distance.
Careful with this
Artillery
one.
thumps roll
Tally
across
checks
the
out.
low hills,
Next crate.
muted by fog and wet earth. A temporary enclosure has been thrown together outside a bomb-scarred town. Barbed wire, wooden posts, and canvas tents darkened by rain and smoke. The ground is soft with mud. Boots sink with every step. A line of women stands silently inside the wire. They wear a mismatched collection of uniforms and civilian coats. Some are Wehrmacht auxiliaries. Others worked in offices, camps, factories. Many have not washed properly in months, some longer. Their faces are tight, unreadable, fixed forward. They have been told what capture means. They have rehearsed it in their minds since the first American tanks appeared on the horizon. On the other side of the wire, U.S. Army soldiers move with procedural calm. Clipboards, crates, standard-issue supplies unloaded from trucks. No shouting, no insults, no spectacle. Then something unexpected happens. Each woman is handed a small bar of soap, a towel, plain, unremarkable, utilitarian. For a moment, no one moves. The women stare at the items in their hands, unsure whether to accept them. This was not part of the story they were told. This was not how the end was supposed to feel. That quiet moment, small, administrative, almost invisible, would stay with many of them for the rest of their lives, and it opens the door to understanding how two worlds collided at the very end of the war. The reasons for that collision begin years earlier, long before this line ever formed. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was no longer a state in the conventional sense. It was a collapsing system held together by fear, habit, and fragments of authority. Cities were shattered. Transportation networks barely functioned. Communications moved slower than the advancing armies. Millions were on the move. Soldiers retreating, civilians fleeing, forced laborers wandering without orders, and administrators trying to preserve paperwork for a world that no longer existed. Women were everywhere in this collapse. Germany's manpower had been bled dry by years of total war. By 1943, the regime had turned increasingly to women to fill roles once reserved for men. They served as Helferinnen, auxiliaries attached to the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS, working as clerks, radio operators, telephone exchange staff, map readers, and administrative personnel. Others worked in armaments factories, transport depots, and supply offices. Some were assigned to concentration camps as guards or administrative staff. Many more were civilians swept into wartime labor systems with little choice. By 1945, distinctions between combatant and non-combatant had eroded almost completely. As Allied forces advanced from the west and the Red Army surged from the east, women found themselves trapped inside retreating columns, abandoned facilities, and collapsing rear area installations. Some were ordered to stay, others were told to flee. Many received no orders at all. Uniforms were discarded and then put back on. Papers were lost, identities blurred. What united these women was not ideology, rank, or role, but fear of capture. Years of propaganda had prepared them for it. Nazi media had painted Allied soldiers, particularly Americans, as unpredictable and brutal. Stories circulated, some invented, some exaggerated, about mistreatment, humiliation, and violence. Official briefings warned auxiliaries that capture would bring punishment and shame. For women associated with the military or camp systems, fear carried an additional weight. They expected retribution. This fear was not irrational in the abstract. On the Eastern Front, it had precedent. Reports of mass violence by advancing Soviet forces spread quickly through retreating populations. Rumors outpaced facts, but the psychological impact was real. By late 1944, many German women believed capture by any enemy force meant the end of personal dignity, if not life itself. American forces, however, occupied a different place in this imagined hierarchy of threat. Less terrifying than the Soviets, but still unknown. For women indoctrinated to expect hostility, the idea of humane treatment felt unlikely. They anticipated interrogation, deprivation, and public humiliation. Basic kindness was not part of the equation. As U.S. armies crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into western and central Germany, they captured not only soldiers but entire administrative worlds. Office staffs surrendered alongside infantry units. Radio stations fell silent mid-shift. Supply depots raised white flags. In many cases, the first American soldiers these women encountered were not frontline fighters, but rear-echelon troops trained to process prisoners quickly and efficiently. Capture was often abrupt, a shouted order, hands raised, a brief search, then movement toward a collection point. There was rarely time for emotional processing. Shock replaced fear. Silence replaced ideology. For female prisoners, the experience was especially disorienting. They were neither typical civilians nor standard POWs. Many did not know how they would be classified or whether they would be protected by the Geneva Convention at all. They carried uniforms that no longer guaranteed status and identities that no longer offered safety. Yet, despite the chaos of the front, American forces approached captivity with a doctrine shaped long before the war reached Germany. A system methodical, bureaucratic, and deliberately impersonal was about to collide with years of expectation and terror in a way no one had anticipated. And at its center was a process that treated hygiene not as mercy, but procedure. Long before American soldiers crossed into Germany, the U.S. Army had already decided how prisoners would be treated, not in speeches or battlefield promises, but in manuals, regulations, and supply tables written years earlier. Captivity, in American doctrine, was not an emotional encounter. It was a logistical problem. The guiding framework was the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, which the United States had ratified and incorporated into military law. Every soldier received at least basic instruction on its principles. Prisoners were to be secured, searched, registered, fed, sheltered in captain's sanitary conditions. Abuse was forbidden not because it was dramatic, but because it disrupted discipline and reflected poorly on command. This approach produced a system that emphasized order above all else. By 1944, the U.S. Army had processed millions of enemy prisoners across multiple theaters. Experience in North Africa, Italy, and France had refined procedures down to the smallest detail. Field manuals specified how prisoners would be moved from the front line to temporary enclosures, then onto larger camps. Separate holding areas were established for officers, enlisted men, civilians, and women. Medical screening was mandatory. Delousing was routine. Clothing was inspected. Personal hygiene was enforced as a matter of public health. Soap and towels were not symbolic gestures. They were listed items. American quartermaster units carried hygiene kits as standard equipment. These kits typically included soap, towels, razors, and disinfectant powder. The reasoning was pragmatic. Lice, typhus, and dysentery had devastated armies in earlier wars. The U.S. Army intended to prevent that at all costs. Clean prisoners were easier to manage, less likely to spread disease, and less likely to destabilize camps. For female prisoners, these procedures were adapted but not abandoned. Women were processed separately, usually by female military personnel when available, or under supervision designed to comply with regulations on decency. The goal was not comfort, it was control through routine. What made this system so disorienting for captured women was how impersonal it was. There was no interrogation at first, no accusations, no speeches about guilt or responsibility. Names were taken, units were recorded, identification papers were examined if they existed. Then came medical inspection and sanitation. Instructions were short, often delivered through interpreters or gestures. There was little explanation beyond what was necessary. To women who had expected punishment, this absence of hostility was unsettling. Many later recalled that it felt unreal, like stepping into a different moral universe without warning. American soldiers themselves rarely reflected on it at the time. For them, this was routine. Processing prisoners was dull work. It was paperwork, waiting, inventory, and supervision. The war's drama existed at the front. Behind it, the machine ran quietly. Yet within that quiet machinery, small details carried enormous weight. A towel meant privacy, even briefly. Soap meant a chance to remove weeks or months of accumulated dirt, sweat, and fear. For women who had lived under conditions of extreme scarcity, where hygiene was rationed or non-existent, these objects represented a restoration of something deeply personal, control over one's own body. It also marked a psychological boundary. Washing became the first moment when many realized they had survived, that whatever they had been told, this was not a place of immediate vengeance. This did not mean kindness replaced accountability. Some women would later face investigation, internment, or prosecution, particularly those connected to camp systems or war crimes. But the first hours of captivity were governed not by judgment, but by procedure. And procedure, carried out without cruelty, could feel like mercy to those who expected none. The stage was now set for an encounter that would be remembered not for what was said, but for what was quietly handed across a table. To understand why it mattered so deeply, the story must now be examined from multiple angles: human, psychological, and institutional, each revealing a different truth about that moment.
For the women standing in those processing lines, the moment did not feel like liberation. There was no sense of relief yet. Relief required trust, and trust had been trained out of them for years. Instead, what they felt first was confusion. Many later described the same reaction in different words: disbelief. The soap and towel were too ordinary, too quiet. They had imagined captivity as loud, shouting, insults, violence, accusation. Instead, there was only routine: a soldier pointing to a wash area, a nod, an instruction given once. Some hesitated to use the soap at all. They wondered if it was a test or a prelude. A few kept the towel folded in their hands, unsure whether they were allowed to unfold it. Others began to wash mechanically, without looking up, as if performing a task they had been trained for but never expected to complete. This was not gratitude, it was disorientation. In personal accounts recorded years later, women spoke of feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. Washing meant acknowledging their condition. Dirt, lice, and exhaustion were no longer abstractions, they were visible. And the act of cleaning themselves forced a recognition that they were no longer inside the world that had shaped them. The shock came not from being degraded, but from being treated as ordinary human bodies in need of care. That ordinariness carried emotional weight. For some, it triggered tears they did not understand at the time. For others, it produced a numbness that lasted for days. A few felt anger, not at the Americans, but at the lies that had prepared them so poorly for reality. The moment lingered because it was intimate without being personal. No one asked about their beliefs. No one demanded confessions. They were not required to perform remorse or loyalty. They were simply processed. That absence of emotional framing made the experience harder to categorize. It did not fit into narratives of punishment or absolution. It was something else entirely. And that made it unforgettable. Totalitarian systems do not rely solely on violence. They rely on expectation. Years of propaganda had conditioned these women to believe that the enemy was cruel by nature, not by circumstance. That belief was supposed to hold even after defeat. What the American processing system did, without intending to, was introduce cognitive dissonance at the most vulnerable moment possible. There was no argument, no counter-propaganda, no attempt to persuade. Instead, indoctrination was undermined by repetition of mundane acts: washing, standing in line, receiving food, sleeping under supervision. Psychologists would later describe this as a form of deconditioning. The brain, primed for trauma, encountered neutrality instead. That gap between expectation and reality forced reassessment. The soap and towel became the first data point in that reassessment. Once the initial shock passed, many women began to reinterpret their situation in subtle ways. If this was not punishment, then what was it? If the enemy behaved according to rules, then what else had been misrepresented? These questions did not emerge fully formed, but they began here, in silence, with water running over skin. Importantly, this psychological shift was not immediate or universal. Some women remained distrustful for weeks. Others interpreted the treatment as temporary, a trick that would soon give way to harsher realities. But even skepticism acknowledged a difference. Routine, repeated daily, reinforced the change. The absence of arbitrary violence became evidence in itself. This was not kindness as an emotional act, it was kindness as structure. And structure, when applied consistently, had the power to dismantle fear without confrontation. That dismantling would take time, but its foundation was laid in these first hours through gestures so small they barely registered for the men performing them. Yet human psychology was only one layer of this encounter. Beneath it lay another truth, one rooted in military discipline, institutional memory, and the way power chose to express itself at the end of a brutal war.
From the American perspective, there was nothing remarkable about the scene. Prisoner processing was designed to remove uncertainty from a chaotic environment. Every step served a purpose. Lines reduced panic. Registration established control. Hygiene prevented disease. Calm reduced resistance. This approach had been shaped by hard lessons. In earlier wars, poorly managed prisoners had led to riots, epidemics, and breakdowns in discipline. By World War II, the U.S. Army understood that control did not require cruelty, it required predictability. Soap and towels were tools in that system. Clean prisoners were easier to supervise. They felt less desperate. They were less likely to spread lice or typhus through camps already strained by numbers. Hygiene was not moral philosophy, it was logistics. Yet logistics had consequences beyond their intent. Order communicated authority without intimidation. It sent a message, unspoken but unmistakable, that this system was stable, confident, and not afraid of its captives. For women who had lived inside a collapsing regime, this contrast was stark. Their own system had ended in improvisation and abandonment. Orders contradicted one another, supplies vanished, authority dissolved into shouting and fear. The Americans, by comparison, appeared unshaken by victory. This calm was itself a form of dominance. Most of these women had imagined captivity as a reckoning. They expected accusations. Some anticipated violence. Others believed they would be paraded, humiliated, or imprisoned in conditions mirroring those they had seen inflicted on others. These expectations were reinforced by years of selective information. Allied bombing campaigns were framed as evidence of cruelty. Reports from the Eastern Front blurred into a single image of universal enemy brutality. Distinctions between armies were erased. As a result, the moment of capture carried intense anticipatory fear. Bodies braced for impact that never came. The absence of immediate punishment was destabilizing. It left emotional energy with nowhere to go. Some women reported feeling more afraid during the first calm hours than they would have under overt hostility. Silence forced reflection, and reflection exposed uncertainty. What followed, the offer of hygiene, made denial impossible. This was not accidental leniency, it was systematic behavior. That realization did not absolve guilt or erase responsibility, but it shattered the certainty of the narrative they had carried with them. History often remembers power when it is loud, violence, declarations, spectacle, but this moment demonstrated a different expression of power, one that did not need to announce itself. The American soldiers did not frame their actions as mercy. They did not ask for gratitude. They did not demand acknowledgement. They simply enforced a standard. That restraint mattered. In withholding humiliation, they denied captives the emotional framework of victimhood that propaganda had prepared. There was no cruelty to confirm expectations, no theater of revenge to validate fear. Instead, power was exercised quietly through regulation and routine. And for the women on the receiving end, that quiet was more unsettling than aggression. It marked a turning point, not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing did. That absence created space, space for fear to drain, space for realization, space for the war finally to end on a personal level. That turning point would crystallize fully in a single stretch of time, a brief window in which expectation collapsed completely and reality took its place. The decisive moment did not involve weapons or orders, but it carried consequences that echoed far beyond the wire. The turning point did not arrive with an announcement, it unfolded over hours. After registration, the women were directed toward makeshift washing areas, sometimes tents, sometimes requisitioned buildings, sometimes nothing more than a screened-off section of open ground. Water was cold. Privacy was minimal but enforced as best the situation allowed. Instructions were short and repeated only if necessary. This was the moment when anticipation finally broke. For weeks, some of these women had lived in constant readiness for violence, muscles tense even at rest, thoughts looping through rehearsed fears. Now, faced with something so ordinary, the body did not know how to respond. Adrenaline had nowhere to go. Hands shook as soap was unwrapped. The smell, clean, chemical, unmistakable, cut through the stench of smoke and sweat that had defined the final months of the war. For many, it was the first time in a long while that the future extended beyond the next hour. Washing was not ceremonial, it was efficient, but in that efficiency lay its power. There was no commentary, no supervision beyond necessity. The act belonged to them. Some women washed quickly, as if afraid the permission would be revoked. Others moved slowly, deliberately, letting the water run longer than needed. A few froze entirely, standing still until prompted again. Reactions varied, but the effect was consistent. This was not punishment. At that realization, something shifted internally. Fear did not disappear, but it lost its sharp edge. The certainty of imminent harm dissolved. In its place came something quieter and more difficult: awareness. Awareness of survival, awareness of exhaustion, awareness of what had been endured. For women who had been taught to expect dehumanization, being allowed, even required, to care for themselves felt like an inversion of power. The enemy had not stripped them of dignity, instead it had assumed it. That assumption carried an unspoken message: you were under control, but you were not beneath us. The psychological impact of that message was profound. It did not demand agreement, it did not erase the past, but it redefined the present. By the time washing ended, the line outside had changed. Shoulders were lower, movements were slower, silence felt different, not tense, but heavy. The next steps followed just as calmly: issuance of food, assignment to holding areas, guards positioned at measured distances, no rush, no chaos. Yet for many women, the decisive moment had already passed. The war, as they had understood it, had ended not with a surrender document or a shouted command, but with water running off their hands. And as the hours continued, the full weight of that realization began to settle, bringing with it reactions no one had anticipated.
As evening approached, the processing areas grew quieter. The distant sound of artillery faded, replaced by the low, constant noises of a camp settling into routine. Guards rotated shifts, supplies were counted, reports were filed. For the American soldiers, this was the end of another long day. For the women, it was the first night of a new reality. It was then, away from the mechanics of processing, that the emotional impact fully emerged. Some women began to cry without clear cause, not loudly, not collectively, quietly, in isolation, as if the body had finally received permission to react. Others sat awake long after lights out, staring into darkness, replaying the day in fragments. In later testimonies, several women described the same realization. They were more unsettled by humane treatment than they would have been by brutality. Brutality would have confirmed expectations. It would have fit the narrative they had been prepared to inhabit. Calm, regulated captivity did not. The offer of soap and towels became the moment they marked as the beginning of that dissonance. It was where certainty collapsed. Some interpreted the experience as humiliation turned inside out. They had expected to be stripped of dignity and instead found it preserved. That preservation forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths, not about the enemy, but about themselves, their beliefs, and the system they had served. For women associated with administrative or camp roles, this realization carried particular weight. The contrast between their treatment and the conditions they had witnessed or enforced elsewhere was impossible to ignore. The absence of cruelty became a mirror. This did not produce immediate remorse or understanding, but it created a crack in the psychological armor that propaganda had built, and once cracked, it could not be fully repaired. The American soldiers, largely unaware of this internal reckoning, continued their routines. They enforced rules. They maintained distance. They did not seek acknowledgement. That distance allowed the experience to stand on its own, uncolored by personal interaction. By morning, the camp functioned as intended. Prisoners were accounted for, schedules were posted, life moved forward within fences. But something irreversible had already occurred. The women now understood that survival did not require submission to cruelty, that captivity could exist without degradation, that the end of the war, at least in this place, did not look like the terror they had been promised. That understanding would follow them long after they left the camps, into repatriation, interrogation, and post-war life. And it would shape how they remembered not just their captors, but the moment their old world truly ended. The consequences of that realization, personal, institutional, and historical, would unfold slowly, measured not in days, but in decades. To see them clearly, the story must now turn to what came after the wire fell. In the weeks that followed, captivity settled into a rhythm defined less by emotion than by administration. The women were moved from temporary enclosures to more established holding camps. Some remained only briefly before repatriation. Others were transferred to internment facilities pending investigation. A smaller number were separated for questioning related to specific roles they had held during the war. For most, daily life became structured and predictable. Meals arrived at set times. Roll calls were conducted without ceremony. Medical inspections continued. Hygiene remained enforced. The same soap and towels that had first shocked them were replaced regularly, issued as part of camp maintenance rather than exception. What had felt extraordinary on the first day became routine. That routinization mattered. As days turned into weeks, fear slowly receded. Not because uncertainty vanished, many still did not know what awaited them, but because the environment no longer fed panic. There were rules, and those rules were applied consistently. Punishment, when it occurred, followed procedure rather than impulse. For women classified as auxiliaries or civilian workers, this often meant eventual release and return to devastated home regions. Transportation was slow, records were incomplete, some waited months before being moved, but the expectation of arbitrary violence never returned. For others, particularly those linked to concentration camps or security organizations, the path was more complex. Humane treatment during initial capture did not exempt them from accountability. Investigations were conducted, files were compiled, some were transferred to Allied authorities for further proceedings. Yet even in these cases, the contrast between expectation and reality persisted. Detention was firm, but regulated. Interrogations were structured. Physical abuse was not policy. Many women later remarked on this distinction, not to excuse their own actions, but to describe the shock of encountering a system that separated justice from vengeance. The American camps themselves were imperfect. Overcrowding occurred, supplies sometimes ran rampant, cultural misunderstandings created tension, but the core principles held. Hygiene, food, shelter, and medical care were treated as obligations, not rewards. This consistency reshaped memory. When survivors later spoke of captivity, they often struggled to convey why the first day mattered more than the months that followed. The camp routine faded, the investigations blurred. What remained vivid was the moment expectation failed. The offer of soap and towels became shorthand for something larger, the realization that the war's end did not have to mirror its brutality. That realization followed them home. As women returned to ruined cities and villages, they carried stories that conflicted with dominant narratives. These stories were not always welcome. Post-war societies sought clarity, heroes and villains, guilt and innocence. Nuance unsettled that process. Yet privately, many held on to the memory as a dividing line. Life before capture, life after. And as years passed, historians, psychologists, and interviewers would begin to notice how often that dividing line appeared in testimony, not as an act of forgiveness, but as a moment of awakening. To understand how deeply it shaped post-war reflection, the story must now move beyond the camps and into the long shadow they cast.
In the decades after the war, when memories hardened into testimony, the moment of capture emerged again and again in interviews, letters, and oral histories, not because it was dramatic, but because it resisted simplification. Many women struggled to describe it without sounding contradictory. They had been defeated, imprisoned, and stripped of agency, yet they had also been treated with a restraint they had not believed possible. That contradiction stayed with them. Some accounts surfaced in denazification hearings, where former auxiliaries attempted to explain the psychological world they had inhabited. Others appeared in private diaries, never intended for publication. A few were recorded by post-war researchers studying trauma and indoctrination. Across these sources, a pattern appeared. The first hours of American captivity were remembered in unusually precise detail. Soap, towels, water, silence. These details mattered because they disrupted a moral script that had seemed fixed. For women raised inside an authoritarian system, power had always announced itself through domination. Authority humiliated in order to assert itself. Order was enforced through fear. The American approach inverted that logic. This inversion did not produce admiration in every case. Some remained bitter. Others dismissed the experience as irrelevant compared to what followed: loss of family, destruction of home, long-term stigma. But even among the dismissive, the memory persisted. In contrast, women captured on the Eastern Front or in areas reached first by Soviet forces often described a radically different experience. Their testimonies, when placed side by side, highlight how captivity shaped post-war psychology as much as ideology or guilt. Where fear had been confirmed, it calcified.
Where it had been contradicted, it fractured. This divergence influenced how survivors spoke or chose not to speak about the war. Those whose expectations had collapsed were often more willing to reassess what they had been taught, not immediately and not publicly, but over time. Historians later noted that moments of humane treatment often marked the beginning of self-questioning, not because they absolved responsibility, but because they removed the last psychological refuge, the belief that everyone was the same. The American soldiers involved rarely left records reflecting awareness of this impact. To them, it had been procedural, a job done according to regulation, another day in a long war. That asymmetry between intention and effect is part of what gives the moment its historical weight. No monuments mark these encounters, no official reports highlight them. They survive only in memory, passed quietly from one life to another. Yet their significance lies precisely there, in the way small, regulated acts shaped how the end of the war was understood by those who had lived inside its machinery. As the years passed and witnesses grew fewer, the meaning of that moment shifted again. It became less about captor and captive and more about the nature of power itself. That is where the story finally comes to rest, not in judgment, but in reflection.
War is often remembered for its extremes: explosions, sieges, mass movements of armies. It is easy to focus on violence, strategy, or heroism, yet history also unfolds in quiet, almost invisible moments. The story of women captured by American forces in 1945 reminds us of this. The act of handing a bar of soap and a towel was mundane in procedure, but extraordinary in consequence. It symbolized a fundamental principle that power can be exercised without humiliation, authority without cruelty. In a war defined by brutality, that simple gesture became a pivot point, a human-scale measure of dignity restored. For the women, it was disorienting because it challenged everything they had been taught. Fear had been their constant companion, yet here was an enemy who treated them as people rather than symbols. Survival, they discovered, could coexist with respect. Expectation and reality diverged, leaving room for reflection, awareness, and, slowly, understanding. History remembers the collapse of regimes, the fall of cities, the surrender of armies, but it is also shaped by these small human encounters, where morality and procedure intersect. The soap and towel are not grand gestures. They did not win the war, yet they illustrate something more enduring, that even amid total war, ordinary acts can leave extraordinary impressions. In the end, the moment matters because it reveals the subtle ways human systems affect human lives. It teaches that dignity, though fragile, can persist, and sometimes it is the quietest acts that echo the longest. The war ended, but the memory of calm care amidst chaos endured, a testament not to victory, but to the possibilities of humanity, even in its darkest hours.